Joining us now is Professor Isaac Khambule, political economy expert from the University of Johannesburg. Prof, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this afternoon. So those global reciprocal tariffs have now been imposed. What do you think will be the immediate impact, especially on our economy now going forward?
And good afternoon to your viewers as well. So if we look at the trade tariffs that have been imposed by the US, those are tariffs that have been mainly targeted at the entire global economy, not just South Africa. And one of the key things that we must also understand is it is mainly developing nations that are going to be at the setback or at the back end of this particular deal, because they mainly depend on the trade surplus that they mainly have with your leading European and as well as within the US. So for South Africa on its own, it's going to be a core issue that has implications for trade deals such as Agoa, because we know majority of the deficit that we see the US trying to make up for comes from the Agoa Act, of which gives South Africa preferential treatment in terms of the goods that we are exporting to the US. So it seems that it is likely to be a bloodbath in terms of job opportunities within the agricultural sector, whereby we know majority of the people tend to find employment.
Speaking of the agricultural sector, my colleague Mobile Madlala a little earlier on at the Gauteng Investment Conference spoke to the MEC of Agriculture in the province of Gauteng, Ms. Vuyisa Ramakgopa, and she was speaking about the relevance and the role of South Africa and SADC within the region, and in terms of the role that they play in agricultural exports, and the biggest citrus exporter being South Africa. Do you think that South Africa can leverage on the African Continental Free Trade Area in response to these tariffs?
It seems to be that that's one of the key approaches that South Africa is going to undertake. But we also know, again, even if we move away from the citrus sector, we know that majority of the African nations tend to be more agricultural productive driven. So there is also going to create competition even within the SADC region and the entire Africa region. But we do know that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement does have certain provisions. But as it stands, I think it's going to be a case of all African nations trying to look abroad and in terms of where they can diversify and also ensure that their agricultural produce are going to. For example, there are emerging markets in Asia. There are also emerging markets that are also popping up within the Middle East, whereby we know that agricultural produce tends not to be as effective because of their climate. So these are the avenues that Africa is supposed to be looking to. And again, South Africa has been one of the dominant trading partners within the entire African continent. But what we find is there has been lesser trade amongst African countries, and this does indeed present an opportunity for Africa to look into that. But secondly, I think one of the key things that is also emerging is, why is Africa still reliant on being much of an agriculture-driven economy and instead of industrializing? Because now these are the consequences that we are starting to see, because it had been the case that Africa had industrialized like the other late industrialized economies, they would not be as impacted in terms of these particular tariffs.
Are there windows for Africa to start industrializing at that scale that you mentioned, that we wouldn't be so dependent on the West in the way that we are?
There's a huge opportunity, and for Africa and many other developing nations, this is an opportune moment. But I think the core issue then that they are likely to face is the issue of investment, because they've been mainly reliant on foreign aid, even for infrastructure development. That is likely going to hamper those particular African regions. But for countries such as South Africa, where we see that there has been a heavy deindustrialization project, it is time for the government then to go back and ask themselves, what is it that we're going to do to reindustrialize and ensure that we can create other jobs in the industrial sector? But secondly, it also presents an important opportunity for South Africa's SOEs, particularly the likes of the DPSA and as well as your Industrial Development Corporation, because it provides space to internationalize these state-owned enterprises and continue investing in infrastructure projects throughout the Africa continent to ensure that the growth of Africa again also benefits South Africa. But most importantly, I would also say that it is definitely time that we need to start talking about industrialization and as well as promoting intra-Africa trade to ensure that these particular trade barriers are not going to hit the African economy hard.
Speaking of those trade barriers, I mean, the presidency reacted with a statement with regards to the tariffs and saying that these tariffs affirm the urgency to negotiate a new bilateral and mutually beneficial trade agreement with the U.S., saying that this is an essential step to secure long-term trade certainty between the two countries. Do you still think there is an opportunity for these negotiations to happen in such a way that could still benefit South Africa?
I think from the hostility that we have been facing from the US, it clearly shows you that there is no space, in as much as it is a wish of our government to continue these bilateral discussions. But the main thing from the US, especially from President Trump and as well as Elon Musk, the idea is South Africa is committing particular atrocities that they are against. South Africa needs to do away with the Expropriation Act. South Africa needs to do away with the BEE laws and all of those. And these are particular conditions that South Africa is unable to meet because of its transformative agenda. So the US is likely not going to take heed to whatever South Africa says. And as an important factor here, South Africa should start also looking at other trading partners. I mean, for example, China is one of our leading trade partners. The idea then is, how does South Africa also open up to other economies within East Asia, such as your Japan, such as your South Korea, where we know that these economies have done quite well, and we know that whatever is happening now with these tariffs, the US is also leaving a huge vacuum that of a country that is going to be willing to say it's fine, go ahead and trade with us. And it also opens up opportunities for countries such as China to leverage from these particular tariffs. And as you've seen within the automotive sector, that China has basically leverage for much of the lower tariffs that they tend to have with many African countries, with South Africa being one of the leading countries, because we can see how cheaper Chinese cars are compared to your traditional makers such as your BM, your Volkswagen, and a number of others.
Well, certainly they do say that out of every adversity comes opportunity. Thank you for your time, Prof. Khambule. That's Professor Isaac Khambule, the political economy expert from the University of Johannesburg, giving his reaction there to the global reciprocal tariffs that have been imposed by the US.